Chapter 18. A Harrowing Rescue. Frank Hardy appraised the situation in a single swift glance. With an iron nerve, he issued crisp orders. "Joe, you're the lightest. Into the tree. You haul Bobby up. Chet, this boulder is loose from the rain. Put your back to it. Roll it down on that cat." Meanwhile, Frank shone the beam of his flashlight directly into the eyes of the puma, in an effort to delay the creature's death-dealing spring as long as possible. Joe had already swung himself into the big tree. In another moment, he'd crawled out on the low-hanging limb directly over Bobby's head. Seeing the beams of the flashlights, the small boy looked up and spotted Joe. But Joe and the branch were several feet out of Bobby's reach. Thinking quickly, Joe hooked his knees over one limb and his toes under another. Head downward and reaching with both arms, he swung into the space between the cat and the boy. "Bobby, grab my hands, quick!" Paralyzed with fear, Bobby hesitated, and in that same instant, the powerful black beast, with a snarl, shot forward. There was a sudden loud crash of underbrush, and the animal whirled and then jumped sideways to dodge the heavy boulder tumbling down the hillside. Quickly, Joe grabbed Bobby's thin wrist and yanked the boy one-handed upward, until he could grasp Bobby's waist with his other arm. And then, with a tremendous effort, he snapped both himself and Bobby into a sitting position on the safety of the limb. Frustrated, the big cat raged for a moment on the ground below, and then it disappeared in the woods. Sweating profusely from his effort, Joe handed the limp boy through the branches of the tree to Frank. "Nice work with that rock, Chet," Joe gasped as he fought to recover his breath. "It gave me the extra second I needed." Bobby Thompson was sobbing again, but now it was with relief, as he buried his face against Frank's chest. "Don't worry, Bobby, old fellow," said Chet. "We'll take you home. We know where your dog is, and we're going to get him back." "Honest?" Bobby asked. With Chet lighting the way in the front, Frank followed, carrying the exhausted boy. Joe watched the rear in case the cat might still be stalking them. The boys worked their way across the side of the hollow until they reached the path. Soon they'd climbed into the clearing near the ruins of Captain McGuire's cabin. Chain lightning now zigzagged across the sky, showing great piles of menacing clouds. But the rushing wind had already passed over, and between the crashes of thunder came the lulls of dead silence. "Look, what's that?" called Joe, pointing off into the distance. The boys had stopped to rest at the very rim of the hollow. "You mean those lights way down at the other end of the valley?" asked Chet. "Yes. If my sense of direction is right," continued Joe with rising excitement, "those lights are on the rim of the hollow just above Walter Donner's place." "You're right," agreed Frank. "Something is going on over there, fellows. And I don't think it has anything at all to do with witches." "Let's get Bobby home," urged Chet, "and then we can get over there and see what it's all about." On the double now, Frank, Joe, and Chet hurried with the little boy to where they'd parked the yellow convertible. Soon they were racing down the steep rim road. Veering sharply, Frank pulled into the rutted drive by the side of the Thompsons' house. Lights were on in all of the rooms. As the car stopped, Mrs. Thompson, nearly hysterical, flew out from the porch. "You must help me! My little boy! He's been gone since supper. I'm so afraid he's lost in the woods. And then there's been that terrible scream." "Hi, Mommy," said Bobby sleepily from Frank's arms. "Don't worry, I'm okay." Open-mouthed, the astonished mother stared for a moment, and then snatching her son, she folded him in her arms. "He was looking for his dog, and I guess he got lost," Chet exclaimed. Thinking it wise to say nothing, of the mysterious cat-like beast for the time being. But we're going to bring his dog back too, aren't we, Bobby? Suddenly, Mrs. Thompson looked at them intensely. "Tell me," she demanded, "where did you find him?" "Not in Black Hollow." "Yes, we did, Mrs. Thompson," Frank answered. "But don't worry, he's okay. I think it would be best if you put him right to bed. We'll be back to explain everything in the morning." The amazed and grateful woman called her thanks as the three young boys jumped into their car. The wheels spun on the gravel road, and then the car started up the hill. "Now," Frank told the others, "we'll drive right around the rim. But hang on to your seats, because this isn't much of a road." Joe and Chet, peering ahead, saw that Frank was right. The road soon narrowed to a pair of wheel ruts, and in places it was dangerously close to the edge of the hollow. A single wrong twist of the wheel could mean a fatal plunge into the valley below. Frank drove swiftly, but with a firm hand. Though bushes and low branches smacked against the windshield, he did not slow down. "What's this ahead?" he asked suddenly. The headlights had picked up an abandoned vehicle. Joe jumped out to investigate. "Just an old jalopy. Probably abandoned there a year ago or so," he reported back as he got back in the car. "It's parked on the very edge of the bluff." Frank drove on toward the mysterious lights that they had seen earlier. All at once he stopped the car. They had reached a little wider space in the road. "There's room here to turn around. We might want to get out of these woods in a hurry. I think I'll play it safe." He pointed the convertible back in the direction of McGuire's clearing. "Now, let's go. We can't be more than 5 minutes from those lights." There were no sounds, except those of the storm, which was just about to break. A flash of lightning and the crack of thunder came simultaneously. It was followed by a continual rumble, and the lightning was so frequent that flashlights were unnecessary. Stealthily, Frank, Joe, and Chet crept forward along the narrow track. Suddenly, a man's voice was heard, saying, "Here, grab onto the other end of this, will you?" Quickly, the boys ducked into the cover of some bushes. Ahead of them, the lightning showed up in the dark bulk of a heavy truck. As they watched, two men, struggling and puffing, lifted a long box from the tailgate and carried it between them among the trees at the edge of the hollow. "Where are they going with it?" Joe wondered in a whisper. "They'll fall over the bluff if they're not careful." Tense but patient, the youths waited. Still, the two men did not reappear. By now, the Hardys were rapidly putting two and two together. The once baffling clues in the strange case began to fall into place, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. "Listen," said Frank. "You know the two owls that Simon drew and then crossed out? Now that I think of it, he must have meant that the birds don't make the sounds. Their cries are man-made. They're signals to these men with the truck. One to stay away, and one to come to the hollow. I wonder which is which." "Not only that," Joe added, "somebody is playing witch, using the old story of the missing dogs and the screams to scare people away while this unloading is going on." "I'll bet one of the stolen dogs was parceled out by Donner to those hijackers that we caught in the station wagon," put in Chet. "The dog acted friendly at first, but the crooks must have trained them to attack on command." "Sure," Joe declared. "Walter Donner and his gang are hijackers. They're probably the same gang that Dad is trying to track down." "Do you remember how Donner laughed at the police for not catching the thieves?" Frank reminded him. "He must think he's pretty clever." "Captain McGuire probably suspected something," he went on. "He came down to investigate. And I'm afraid that he was taken prisoner. Or something worse. But if he's a prisoner, Joe puzzled, where are they keeping him? Say, remember the door we heard closing in Donner's kitchen? We didn't see it. That door might be the answer. Eager now to learn more, the three friends grew more impatient by the minute, as the two men failed to return to the truck. We must trail them, Frank decided. One at a time and watch yourselves. We can't afford to get caught in a trap now. First, Frank slipped cautiously from bush to bush, past the silent truck to the trees at the top of the hollow. Joe followed, and then Chet. Warily they peered ahead. The two hijackers were nowhere to be seen. Frank led his companions through the narrow belt of trees and out onto the exposed edge of the bluff. Again they stopped to reconnoiter. Frank, Joe, and Chet were now crouching in the narrow ridge of small bushes that grew along the rim. Directly in front of them was nothing but bare rocks, curving sharply to the floor of the hollow below. By now the wind had come up again, and behind them the trees waved wildly. Even in the bush, the boys could feel its force. Constant flashes of lightning threw a clear white light over everything, so clear that every individual tree in Black Hollow stood out distinctly. By leaning forward slightly, the boys could see the roof of Walter Donner's cabin and the small clearing surrounding it. There were Donner's sheep, moving around nervously in their three-sided pen. But to the boys' amazement, there was absolutely no trace of the hijackers. "They're not up here, and they're not down there," whispered Joe, bewildered. "Anyhow, how could they get down there, especially with that heavy box? These rocks are much too steep." Baffled, the boys worked their way along the rim directly above the Donner cabin. Joe led the way, examining the rock face for some possible way into the hollow below. Suddenly Frank cried out from behind Joe, but the cry was choked off. Turning, Joe and Chet found that their companion had vanished completely, as though swallowed up by the earth. End of chapter 18.